I haven't cried this hard, this hysterically. Yeah, I don't actually remember the last time I cried like this. I feel almost bad because the past few books I've now talked about, previous one being The Poppy War and now the one I'm going to talk about this time, in addition to a film, have all been linked or related to some kind of like horrific tragedy. Whereas in the Poppy War, I mentioned it dealt with the rape of Nanting. Today, I'm going to be talking about a film and a book. The book in question I'm going to be talking about today is Human Acts by Kang. And this is a novel that deals with the Gwangju Uprising of 1980. But before I get into Human Acts, I want to talk about the film that eventually led me to Human Acts, and we'll talk a bit also about the Gwangju Uprising of 1980. So the film in question is called A Taxi Driver, or 택시운전사, not to be confused in any way with Martin Scorsese's film. A Taxi Driver is a 2017 South Korean historical action drama film that was directed by Jang Hoon and stars Song Kang-ho, who you might recognize from Parasite, as well as Thomas Kretschmann, who you might recognize from The Pianist. This film is based upon the real-life story of German journalist Jürgen Hinspeter. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. I'm not good with German. And a taxi driver by the name of Kim Sa-bok, who helped get him into the city of Gwangju in 1980 in the middle of their May uprising. Now, before I say anything more about this film, yes, it is a dramatization, and a lot of the fictionalization of the story actually centers around the character of Kim Sa-bok himself, and that is because Hinspeter was never able to meet Sa-bok again in their lifetime. He was never able to find him again after the events of 1980, so he didn't know what happened to him, and he really didn't know anything about his life. So the filmmakers kind of had to make it up because they didn't know who he was. It actually really wasn't until this film was released, I believe, that Kim Sa-bok's son actually came forward and said, oh no, that was my dad, and he had photographic evidence to prove that his dad was this taxi driver, and he told them all the true story of what happened to his father after the incident in May 1980. It was actually quite sad. I do believe he became an alcoholic and died, I think, of complications related to alcoholism, or it was some kind of cancer, in 1984. I believe his son has said that the events of 1980 really kind of traumatized his dad and affected his psyche, and that is why he turned to alcohol. Now, this film I'd wanted to see for a while. To be honest, I don't know how I stumbled down whatever rabbit hole I stumbled down to find out a little bit about the Gwangju Uprising, because I had never learned about this. In fact, in a complete failure of the American education system, I did not realize how long it took for South Korea to actually become a democracy. I did not realize that in 1980, they were under martial law, under a military dictatorship. No one taught me this. It's one of those things where I think the Americans just go, yeah, okay, Korea War happened, and after that, yay, democracy, oh, and North Korea. No, that's not what happened at all. And in fact, the events of 1980, there are people who were still alive, who were there. And this is basically a collective countrywide trauma. And it has been contentious ever since it happened. So what is the Gwangju Uprising? So Gwangju is a city in the southwestern area of the Korean peninsula, and the Gwangju Uprising was essentially a popular uprising that happened in the city of Gwangju, as you can guess, that began on May 18th, and it resulted in at least around something like 600 people being killed. So what had happened was the year before, the president, the dictator, named Park Chung-hee, had been assassinated. And at first, people probably thought that was going to be great because he'd been an authoritarian ruler for something like almost 20 years. And in that power vacuum, you're going to initially have political and social instability. But hey, that means democracy could come in, right? Right? No. Tae Kyu-ha was the initial successor after Park's death, but he really didn't last that long because the Major General Chun Do-hwan seized power through a coup d'etat, and basically, they were under military dictatorship martial law. Now, the result of this was that all of the democratization movements that had been totally suppressed during Park Chung-hee's reign started to come back again. The people, and especially professors and students, really were ready to get involved and do some pro-democracy activities, and that resulted in professors being fired and students being expelled from their respective universities. Now, student unions obviously formed as a result of this, and they led nationwide protests and demonstrations asking for reforms, especially and including the end of martial law. Chun Doo-hwan did not take this well. In fact, the day before what's known as the official start of the uprising, which is May 18th, on the 17th, he basically told the cabinet that we're extending martial law to the entirety of the nation. So now we get to the uprising. On May 18th, a bunch of students gathered at the gates of Cheonam National University because they were pissed that it had been closed. It's said that by about 9:30, around 200 students had actually arrived, and they were being opposed by 30 paratroops. About 30 minutes later, they all clashed. The soldiers charged the students threw stones. The protest moved all the way downtown. The conflict broadened, and by the afternoon, there were about 2,000 people involved in this incident. So initially, it was the police that were handling these protests. However, by about 4 p.m., the Special Warfare Command sent more paratroops over. In fact, they sent 686 soldiers, and this is where the uprising becomes infamous for being even more violent and reaching a new phase of suppression. Anybody who witnessed the event said that the soldiers were clubbing both demonstrators and onlookers, and no matter what anybody tries to say, we have testimonies and photographic evidence and internal records to stand by this statement, as well as the fact that they were using bayonets, again, against both demonstrators and onlookers. As you can imagine, this infuriated the citizens, and by the time you hit May 20th, the number of protesters is at about 10,000 people. Now, as this conflict is escalating, this is where it gets bad. The army opens fire on the citizens. On May 20th especially, there was a huge confrontation outside Gwangju Station. In fact, there's an unknown number of people who were killed there. That same day, protesters burned down the local MBC station because they had been misreporting the situation that was unfolding in Gwangju. Fascinatingly about this is that most of the people outside of Gwangju didn't know what was going on because the military had cut the phone lines going in and out of Gwangju, and they had completely shut the city down. They had blocked all the routes and communications leading in and out of the city, and so nobody knew what was going on. Nobody in the rest of the country knew what was going on. It is said that the violence climaxed on May 21st, and at about 1 p.m., the army fired a protesting crowd that had gathered in front of the Cheonam provincial office, causing a lot of casualties. Now, some protesters did raid armories and police stations around to arm themselves with rifles and carbines, and gunfights then broke out between civilian militias and the army. And the civilian militia was actually briefly able to kind of force the army out. But they didn't hold anything for very long. They literally only held it for a handful of days, because on May 27th, troops from 5 different divisions moved into the downtown area and defeated all of the civil militias within about 90 minutes. That is the backdrop for A Taxi Driver. Now, Jürgen Hans-Peter was a German journalist. He was actually stationed in Japan. He heard word that things were not going well in Korea. Obviously, people knew about President Park's assassination, and they knew then about the military coup d'etat, which had put Chun Doo-hwan in power. And he started to hear that, the democratization protests were starting up again, and they're being pretty brutally suppressed. So he made his way over to Korea in order to find out what was going on. In Seoul, he apparently heard that something is happening in Gwangju. Nobody knows what's going on, but you know something's happening because all of the phone lines have been cut and we're not hearing anything. So he gets Kim Sabok to drive him to Gwangju. They find a way to get into the city, even though it had been blockaded by the military, including all of the backside roads in and out of the city. He makes his way in with his camera and starts reporting. And the things that he sees are absolutely horrifying. He sees the military firing upon, at this point, unarmed civilians, onlookers, no matter what age they were, whether or not they were involved. Poke your head out and you ran the risk of being shot. Now, granted, when he first gets into Gwangju, we are met by a bunch of characters who are college students, so are probably initial demonstrators, one of whom, a student named Jae-sik, actually speaks English, and so he kind of becomes our little guide and buddy who helps Hans-Peter make his way through Gwangju and learn about what is going on. They are there to witness when the television station was bombed, and it is in this confrontation in which they are trying to then run away from plainclothes policemen, who I almost thought were some kind of secret police, because they realize, hey, there's a foreigner here. Oh, and he has a camera. Capture him. They try to escape and make their way out, and Jae-sik actually helps them escape. In a way, he gives himself up so that before he is fully taken away as a hostage, he does ask Hans-Peter to show his footage to the world, let them know what is going on here, because otherwise nobody is going to know. Now, to fact check the movie, Hans-Peter was not the only foreigner who was in Gwangju at the time. There were a couple other foreign journalists who'd found their way in, kind of just like him, and then were also able to sneak out. There were also members of the Peace Corps who, again, managed to sneak their way in to figure things out. It is at this point in the movie that Kim Sa-bok actually briefly kind of leaves, like he gets told he can go, and he's portrayed as having a young daughter who is home alone, and so he really wants to get back to her. But he doesn't even make it all the way because guilt overtakes him and he returns to Gwangju. And this is the moment in the movie that I completely lost my shit. Part of me almost wishes I had filmed my reaction of me watching this film for the first time, but honestly, I'm afraid anybody who watched that footage would think I was over-exaggerating, because I cannot tell you how hysterical I became while watching this movie. It's at this point that Kim Sa-bok returns to Gwangju. He asks where Hans-Peter is. He finds him in the hospital, sitting there in complete shock. He's unharmed. However, we see that one of our fellow taxi drivers, a Gwangju taxi driver, is crying over Jae-sik's corpse. And he tells us that the soldiers were dragging him away. He died from his injuries while they were dragging him. And so they threw his body into like a rice paddy. Like they just flung it out like garbage. I started crying here. And then when hearing Gwangju has run out of coffins, this is not an exaggeration. And that is horrifying. From then on, we get some more firsthand experience of watching the uprising, of what happened when they would shoot down anybody in the road. And then if you tried to go help those people who'd been injured, they would shoot you for that as well. And I'm not even kidding. I was hysterically crying, like rocking back and forth, banging my hand over my chest like this, and crying in like 3 languages because English wasn't enough to encapsulate the grief I felt while watching this. It's interesting how I talk about this, and yet part of me almost feels a sense of imposter syndrome because I am not Korean. I have never lived in Korea. I will never understand the collective trauma that is felt by Koreans and anybody who was there in Gwangju during the uprising. I will never experience or understand that. Emotionally, I will never reach that level, but I can tell you that the movie affected me in a way that I have not been affected for so long. I actually can't remember the last time I was that heavily affected. My dog was severely concerned at why I cried for about 30 straight minutes. I was devastated by this film. And I think that means the film did its job, because unfortunately, I think so many of us in the West don't learn about things like this, and we don't learn that this happened. Now, long story short, yes, Hans-Peter did get the footage out to the world, and so thus the world became aware of what was happening in Gwangju and realizing just how bad it was in South Korea at that time. That brings us to Human Acts by Kang. I do believe this book was written in 2013 and translated in 2014. Yes, this is translated out of Korean. If I were fluent in Korean, I would have a Korean edition of this, and I wish I could be. This novel is not particularly long. In fact, it is under 250 pages. However, it very beautifully encapsulates the collective trauma of Korea with regard to this event and basically gives voice to those who were brutally and violently silenced by their own government as a result of this. In fact, Hong Kong finds a way to give voice to an entire nation as a result. The story actually begins very brilliantly in second-person narrative, so we are using you in our narration, and begins with a young boy named Dong-ho, who we are told is a middle school student who is looking for the corpse of his friend amidst all of the bodies in Gwangju. He'd seen his friend get shot, and now he's trying to find his body because he doesn't know what happened to it. If that doesn't set the stage for you are about to experience a tragedy, I don't know how else to tell you this is going to be a tragedy. We also follow a consciousness that's searching for its abandoned body. We follow an editor who is having work be violently suppressed. We follow students who were captured, rioters who were captured and tortured. We deal with the fallout and the effects of these. This book encapsulates a time period from 1980 to 2013, and the character of Dong-ho is central to all of these stories, which is why he's introduced as the first character. And this book made me cry. Like, actively cry. I was pinging a friend of mine, like, help. I'm just gonna cry and, frankly, hate people. And now I will read to you the little bit that absolutely had me in tears when it came to its conclusion. "You'll surrender at the first opportunity," Jin-soo insisted, still not letting go of the boy's arm. "Surrender. Have you got that? Go out with your hands up. There's no way they'll harm a kid with his hands up." They'd waited until the sound of gunfire could no longer be heard, then put down their weapons and come out to surrender, all as Jin-soo had told them to do. "Look at these bastards," the officer yelled. He was practically frothing at the mouth. "Want to surrender, do you fucking Reds? Want to save your precious skins?" With one foot still on Kim Jin-soo's back, he raised his M16, took aim, and fired. The bullets tore into those school kids without hesitation. My head inadvertently jerked up, and when he whooped in the direction of his subordinates, as good as a fucking movie, right? I saw how straight and white his teeth were. Now do you understand? The kids in this photo aren't lying side by side because their corpses were lined up like that after they were killed. It's because they were walking in a line. They were walking in a straight line, with both arms in the air, just like we'd told them to. This book is a powerful testament to collective trauma. It is so powerful in how straightforward, and how raw and honest it is in its writing. I will also, again, have to give kudos to the translator, because when I read it, I didn't feel like I was reading a translation of something. Coming off the heels of Taxi Driver and having done my own little dive and a bit of research, I was far more familiar with the Gwangju Uprising, and therefore, going into Human Acts, I was prepared for it to be heartbreaking. And it was. Anything that is trying to give a brutalized country its voice back is going to be a hard read. I do believe Hong Kong herself is actually from Gwangju. I don't know how old Hong Kong is, so whether or not she was alive during the uprising, I couldn't tell you. But you would think she was there. This feels less like a work of fiction and more like a collection of true stories. And I think that was probably the idea. I don't think Hong Kong wanted this to feel like a work of fiction, because so much of the fiction that's here was based in fact in terms of things that happened, and the experiences of the people involved, I would wager, were probably taken from accounts of what happened. It's not often that I find a book that I encourage everyone to read because I think it's important. Human Acts by Hong Kong is one of those books. I think this is important. Whether or not you are aware of the Gwangju Uprising or all of the struggles that happened in the late 20th century in South Korea, Human Acts is an important book to read. The Gwangju Uprising is a fairly contentious topic in South Korea. In fact, it gets used as the litmus test to discern between conservative and liberal thinkers and how they feel about the incident. It is an incident which is reasonably forgotten about in the West, likely because we don't learn about it. I never learned about any of this in school. I found out about it through my own interest. The aftermath of the Gwangju Uprising was that it was denounced as a rebellion instigated by Kim Tae-chung and his followers. Kim Tae-chung was convicted and sentenced to death, but his punishment was later reduced in response to international outcries over the incident. Gee, shocked. Overall, nearly 1,400 people were arrested for involvement in the Gwangju incident, and around 430 of them around there were indicted. And among those, 7 received death sentences and 12 received life sentences. Somewhere close to nearly 140 victims were carried in handcarts and garbage trucks to be buried in the old Mangwaldong cemetery on the outskirts of Gwangju. I do believe now that a new Mangwaldong cemetery has been created by the state to educate on and commemorate Gwangju's history. As for what effect this had on South Korean politics, well, Chun Doo-hwan already had some popularity problems, because he took power in a military coup d'etat. What a shock. But his authorization of the dispatchment of special forces against unarmed citizens really put a damper on his legitimacy. It is said by many that the Gwangju Uprising also paved the way for later movements in the 1980s, which eventually, finally, brought democracy to South Korea. The Gwangju Uprising, as a result, has become a symbol of South Koreans' struggle against authoritarian regimes and their fight for democracy. The sad thing is it took almost 7 years for there to be any kind of official re-evaluation of what happened in Gwangju. And that was because direct presidential elections didn't become reinstated until 1987. In 1995, the National Assembly passed a special law on the May 18 democratization movement, which enabled the prosecution of those responsible for the December 12th coup d'etat, which led to the Gwangju Uprising, even though the statute of limitations had run out. And so, in 1996, 8 politicians were indicted for high treason and the massacre. Their punishments were settled in 1997, including a death sentence for Chun Doo-hwan. However, it was then commuted to a life sentence. However, all of these convicts were pardoned in the name of national reconciliation by President Kim Yong-sam, based upon the advice of President-elect Kim Dae-jung. Nowadays, May 18th is an official Memorial Day, and in 2002 there was a law passed privileging bereaved families, and the Mangwaldong Cemetery was elevated to the status of a national cemetery. That is not where the story ends. As you can see, this is, again, collective trauma. It's ongoing. Now, in 2017, we have a new South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, who vowed to reopen the investigation in South Korean government's role in the suppression of the uprising. It was revealed for the first time in February 2018 that the Army had used McDonnell Douglas MD-500 Defenders and Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters to fire upon civilians. In November 2018, Defense Minister Jung Kyung-doo issued an apology for the South Korean military's role in suppressing the uprising and acknowledged that soldiers had engaged in acts of sexual violence during the crackdown as well. However, in 2019 came a big moment. Kim Yong-jong, who was a former intelligence officer in the 501st Military Intelligence Brigade of the U.S. Army, was found to be a witness. He stated in an interview in March 2019, on May 21, 1980, Chun fired near the Jeonil building in the heart of Gwangju and in Yanglim-dong, upstream of Gwangju. The helicopter aircraft I used at that time was remembered as UH-1H and the machine gun as M60 and reported so. Soon after the former president returned to Seoul by helicopter, a mass shooting took place in front of the Gwangju Metropolitan Government and delivered the information to the U.S. Defense Department. He reiterated in May 2019 that Chun Doo-hwan personally ordered troops to shoot protesters based on the intelligence he saw at the time, and that he did, in fact, secretly come to Gwangju on May 21st, 1980 by helicopter to meet 4 military leaders, including Chung Ho-young, then commander of special operations, and Yi Jae-woo, then colonel of the Gwangju 505 security unit. Kim also said that there were undercover soldiers among the Gwangju citizens acting as agent provocateurs to discredit the movement. And thus, in May 2020, 40 years after the uprising, the independent May 18 Democratization Movement Truth Commission was launched to investigate the crackdown and use of military force. Under legislation passed in 2018, it will operate for 2 years with a 1-year extension allowed if necessary. Most of the information that I have given to you on the Gwangju Uprising is admittedly taken from Wikipedia because it can give very nice, short, condensed versions of what happened. I have also found it difficult to find really good history books on the topic that are in English. In fact, there really aren't that many books on the topic regardless because of how controversial it was in South Korea and kind of still is to this day. I feel like I mostly just gave a small history lecture than anything else, but I find this history important. And it is important to understand the context with which I was sobbing during A Taxi Driver and crying while reading Human Acts by Han Kang, which again, I encourage everybody to go read. That being said, I have cried so much in the past couple days, I need more coffee. Some memories never heal. Rather than fading with the passage of time, those memories become the only things that are left behind when all else is abraded. The world darkens like electric bulbs going out one by one. I am aware that I am not a safe person. Is it true that human beings are fundamentally cruel? Is the experience of cruelty the one thing we share as a species? Is the dignity that we cling to nothing but self-delusion, masking from ourselves this single truth, that each one of us is capable of being reduced to an insect, a ravening beast, a lump of meat, to be degraded, damaged, slaughtered? Is this the essential fate of humankind, one which history has confirmed as inevitable?